good afternoon, good evening, good morning, everyone. I welcome you to our session 6, entitled Virtualizing Mobility, Innovations for Internationalization of Higher Education. I'm Gudmundur Eiriksson, professor at Jindal Global Law School. I have the honor of moderating a discussion with 4 panelists, Professor Jane Schukoske, who is with the Sehgal Foundation, but has also a long association with Jindal from its very formative years, for which I thank you, Jane.
Thank you.
Professor Russell Ganim is Associate Provost and Dean of International Programs at the University of Iowa. Professor Fabrizio Marrella is Vice Rector for International Relations and International Cooperation at Università Foscari, Venezia, and Professor Edward Peck, Vice Chancellor and President of Nottingham, Trent University. Thank you all for joining us, and particularly those who are not in our panel. We have had very interesting discussions already in the World University Summit. It was indeed a summit, and you would have noticed that Dr. Joanna Newman, in her keynote address today, identified virtual mobility as one of the main planks of the going forward. Now, let me just spend a minute telling you how we will organize our session. We would begin by asking each of our panelists to set out his or her experiences in this time of COVID, that is his or her experiences or those of his or her institutions. And then we will turn to deal with 4 specific questions. First, on how the pandemic affected the very concept of internationalization at universities across the globe. Secondly, how has the demographic of international students accessing universities changed during the pandemic? Thirdly, whether in the post-19 world internationalization abroad will be replaced by internationalization at home. And finally, how research productivity has been impacted in this area of virtualized collaboration. After discussing these questions, I will be asking our panelists each to step back and address the question that many of us have had over the course of this the pandemic, and is particularly stressed in the discussions earlier. That is, how we can ensure that internationalization of higher education can be based on symmetry, fairness, and equal opportunities to everyone. We will then turn to answer questions from the audience. I encourage all of you watching to enter your questions on the chat as they occur to you. Well, please, we can now turn to our first roundtable discussion. Would you begin, please, Jane?
Yes, thank you, Gudmundur. I'm delighted to be on this panel. And I have been watching the keynote address and the discussion of university social responsibility before this, and they tie so well for those of you who have been watching the earlier sessions. The question to me is what I've been doing during the pandemic, what my institution has been doing during the pandemic. I am a law professor by background, and worked for 14 years in India. Those facts are sort of critical to understanding where I'm coming from here. I'm currently in Arlington, Virginia, and have been working as an academic liaison for Sehgal Foundation and Sehgal Foundation in the US. As academic liaison, I'm helping that NGO doing work in India in rural development, primarily water, agriculture, working with local community participation, stressing gender equity, and running a radio station, so a lot on communications. Normally, we have in-person interns, many from India, many from US during the summer, and some other countries. We've had people from Europe and Canada. And the thing is that virtually we have had students before the pandemic, so it's not something new to us. We've had students from Australia do research with our staff, We've had executive MBA students from Georgetown University help develop a plan for how to enter into a new state in India that the NGO has not been working in previously. So we felt some competence going into the pandemic because of this prior experience. What we've found is, I've worked with a number of US universities. Our longest partner, I think, is the University of Iowa, and I'm very glad that Dean Ganim is with us this morning to give the university side of this partnership. But in terms of working with universities, I find their study abroad staff have been keen to connect students to virtual internships abroad. And so, and that's happening in India as well, where travel to internships is also impossible. So one of the things that happened that's interesting in India during this time is that 20 students from IIT Mumbai virtually volunteered with Sehgal Foundation in small groups of 5, looking at issues like arsenic in water, nitrates in water, and other water contaminants. And then communicating to the staff through Zoom meetings, their overall findings. What Dean Ganim and I have been doing is working with the faculty at Iowa from multiple disciplines, communications, journalism, hydrology, and gender studies, and the staff, senior staff at Sehgal Foundation working on rural development to convene small group meetings to brainstorm how to go forward and develop projects that can be done virtually. This is occurring built on a 12-year relationship between University of Iowa and the Sehgal Foundation. And there is a great deal of mutual trust, mutual interest, fair number of visits to India, and for that matter, visits from Indian staff to University of Iowa. This has been a tremendous opportunity for taking time with each other, to know each other, and to develop mutually beneficial projects for faculty and students.
Oh, thank you very much. And please, Jane, I hope you'll contribute as I, if I may say so, the Indian expert. You'll find many of the keynote speeches dealt with the Indian situation, and we'll call on you to enlighten us on it. You are well placed to have done that over the time you spent in India. Well, Russ, can I call on you then, please?
Oh, sure. And good evening, everyone. It's a real honor for me to be here, and I want to thank the organizers at OP Jindal Global University for putting together this program. I'd also like to thank Gudmundur for moderating this particular panel. So to build on what Jane has said, I think that I would look at mobility in terms of I think there are definitions that we can also put toward mobility. I think agility, flexibility, openness. As Jane has mentioned, University of Iowa, which is a large major research institution in the Midwest, and the Sehgal Foundation have been working together for several years. One of the trustees lives in Iowa. He is an alum of our university, so our connections are very close. What I think has impressed me the most about COVID times is the willingness of partners to become closer to one another, to work together, to find new ways to form creative partnerships. I think it's very easy, just from the standpoint of human nature, to kind of let things go when we're not operating in a conventional format. We're used to traveling, folks from Sehgal are used to coming to Iowa, and our faculty and students are used to going to India on a pretty regular basis. All of that's been interrupted. So rather than sort of succumb to the sullenness or the depression that might set in because of the pandemic, I think we've kind of rallied around each other and found new ways to work together and to create, more importantly, new opportunities for our students. And we've seen that on the faculty side, we've seen that on the NGO side. So I think this kind of bonding, just from the standpoint of kind of human connectivity, really helps us move forward. And I've seen it not just with Sehgal and India, but with connections that we have in Malaysia, in Africa. I think that internationalists are even more committed to global interaction and global education now than they were even before the pandemic. I think that the pandemic has underscored how interconnected we are and how we need to continue to forge these bonds if we're going to solve the problems that are facing us.
Well, thank you very much. And in fact, if I just speak from my own experience and following up on what you said, it's rather counterintuitive, isn't it? That we are much closer now when we're not sitting next to each other in conference rooms. I speak from my own experience. I feel like I'm a tutor, a personal tutor to my 60 or 70 students. Instead of just sitting in front of a classroom, I actually interact in their homes with them, dealing with the problems, of course, which have been exacerbated by the pandemic. But anyway, thank you for that. Fabrizio, will you take?
Sure. Well, first of all, congratulations are in order, but I subscribe with what Russell has just said. Probably, if we want to introduce a famous quotation, we could say, citing a famous international law books by Rosalind Higgins, international law as a process, we have learned that internationalizations in university is also a process. And nobody could suspect that we would have arrived at this point of time. And I have to say, in my own institution, we are a public university, we are a national university, and we are also a European university, which means that we are also under EU law. And what is fascinating for me is that in a very short period of time, the entire faculty and entire student body, either from Foscari or from elsewhere in the world, we have exchange programs with the 5 continents, could learn quickly to use these platforms, which was simply something esoteric, limited for some top-level researchers only 2 years ago. I'm talking about older colleagues. I'm talking about younger colleagues who are not from economics or, let's say, hard sciences, but are as humanists. They are they have the right to think that a human interaction is much more important than a computer interaction. But everybody, in the end, has learned to use that and to use it well. I have to say that even the students, which were rather hostile at the beginning, which may seem strange to some, because saying young generation should be happier with technology than not, have shown many interesting aspects. First, that they really like human interaction with professors, something that professors did not suspect, but also the skills that they have learned in this period are terrific skills that they will use in their next work. I mean, I teach normally international law and international arbitration. Now, I wasn't even imagining that students could learn international arbitration, which is a procedure, by using this device. And not only they learn that, but even I would say that in these 2 years' time, they've even learned to do international arbitration via platforms, which is probably something that many of the top-notch lawyers in the world can do it right now. So there are opportunities, as always, in these big changes. And I think that from the learning point of view and from the working point of view, it has been quite useful. There's a positive aspect of that, and not only negative aspects. There is also a human rights aspect, but I want to touch upon that because I know that we will go back on that. So that will be my take.
Yeah, thank you. Indeed, one thing we have to bear in mind in this panel is that most of us speaking from the perspective of the first world, and we have to bear in mind, and we'll come that to our later questions, the different situation faced by other parts of the world. And Jane, you can join us on that with respect to India. And please, Edward, would you carry on this introductory roundtable?
Yeah, thank you. So I'm going to be slightly more downbeat about the impact initially. I'm going to give you 3 negatives and 3 positives, I think, of the last 18 months. And the negatives may be short term, but I think they're still negatives. The first is that what we've given to our students, whether be they domestic students or international students, in the last 18 months is not what they signed up for, and it's not what they paid their fees for. And I just think we need to hold on to that thought. We've just had the results of the graduating class survey in the UK, where satisfaction has dropped across all universities by about 12 to 15% from the previous year. And I think much of that disaffiliation is to do with a lack of the extracurricular activities, not particularly the teaching, but the extracurricular stuff, including, of course, outward mobility. The second downbeat thing I'd say is there's been a major impact on the mental health and well-being of our students. Again, across the UK, I think the pandemic has hit the young far harder than the old, unless of course you're very old. And so it hasn't affected my life very much, but it has affected the life of many of the young people who attend my university. And the third thing to reflect on is it's created significant financial anxiety for universities who did not know how many international students, or indeed domestic students, they were going to get last autumn, and are not entirely sure, indeed at all sure, how many international students are going to arrive in the UK this autumn. And that's a moving feast as countries come and go from what we call our red list, which requires you to quarantine. How many of those students will start online? How many of those students they start online will stay online? How many will actually decide to do something else with their time? So I do think we have to recognise there have been some downsides the last 12 months. We can't adopt an entirely upbeat tone. The 3 positive things I'd say is that I think, and it's been said already, the confidence and competence of our colleagues in using online platforms. We've made more progress in 18 months than we'd have made in 5 years in that respect without COVID-19. And that involves things like online assessment and online field trips, which I think is relevant to our current topic. The second, I think, is that we have used some very interesting tools, particularly around virtual internationalization, and we've mobilized the resources of the whole institution. So we have experts in virtual reality, in games technology, as well as in computing and collaborative platforms. And I think we've used those to create the sorts of experiences virtually that, again, we wouldn't have bothered to do in the next 5 years if it wasn't for COVID-19. So a real leap forward, I think. The other thing, which reflects on the theme of this session we'll come back to later, is when you start to use those online activities, particularly for our poorer students, we have seen an improvement in their engagement with their studies, and they've done better in their final year exams. So there's something about using technology that looks like it levels up between our poorer students, financially poorer students, and our richer students. And I think we should hold on to that and see what more we can do with it.
Well, thank you very much. And certainly I can endorse the first of your 2 downsides from my own experience in India. That is the student dissatisfaction, and probably, as you mentioned, because of the lack of intercurricular activities and engagement with other students, and the health issue. I know that from a very personal point of view, as I've surveyed each of my students over the course of the time. And then the trouble with that, the health issues, is that unlike in our university, when there's a support system set up in their homes, particularly when they're isolated, they don't have those facilities. Well, thank you for those opening comments. And please, could I ask you to carry on the first of our questions, that is, how the pandemic has affected the very concept of internationalization.
Thank you. And before the pandemic, I suppose, like many of your universities, we've been having increasing student activism, and particularly activism around sustainability. It has usually manifested itself in calls for universities to disinvest from certain industries or certain companies. And I think that's now moved on, or will move on, to how people feel about international travel. I think it's the next place that young people will go. And that's partly driven by the young climate activism we've seen over the last 5 years, which has been international. There have been school protests around the world, haven't there? And I think the young people coming through the school system are much more likely to be wary of personal activities and want to challenge themselves and institutions about their responsibility for sustainability. In the UK, this will be highlighted because, of course, we have COP26 in November. And I think that will bring a renewed emphasis to climate protest, much of which is led and organised by young people. And then COVID-19, I just think, has had an impact on the fact that we can use technology to do all sorts of things we didn't think we could do, and young people have noticed that. I think that they may have become slightly more inward-looking and introspective, and they may now be starting to think that not all of the benefits of globalization are quite what we thought they were, and that the pandemic demonstrates a significant downside of globalization, and therefore the spread of global infection. So it may be that regardless of what our institutional strategies want to do and what our own priorities are, the simple fact might be that student pressure and student choice starts to mitigate against virtual actual globalization, mobilization, and starts to prioritize virtual mobilization.
Thank you. Russ, would you carry on, please?
Oh, sure. So just to pick up on a couple of Edward's points, I think that there has been, an increasing awareness of the carbon footprint that international travel carries. And as a result, we've seen, at least on our campus, and I think throughout at least certain sectors of the United States, a renewed emphasis on sustainable development goals as defined by the UN, and trying to work those into our curricula really across different disciplines. So it's not just the hard sciences, but also the social sciences, the humanities, and even the arts. That said, I do think that even though that there will be this kind of resistance to international travel and polluting the planet, we will see, or at least we've experienced in this country, pent-up demand for travel, both domestic and international. And my sense is that as the rest of the world becomes vaccinated and we start returning to normality, that this pent-up demand will express itself, at least for a time, in increased international travel. What I do foresee is, say, within the next 1.5 to 2 years, that this will level off. We've gotten used to the convenience of Zoom. We've been able to do project work via Zoom. We've been able to organize global classrooms via virtual technology, and that won't go away. Convenience is something that people don't give up easily, especially if there is an environmental benefit to it. Now, we have forces in this country that resist this type of ecological consciousness. And so that's going to be a constant struggle as we move forward. But I do think that we will come to some sort of equilibrium where we will continue to value the human interaction that comes from travel, but do it less on the scale that we experienced before the pandemic.
Yeah, thank you for that. Well, we were going to discuss how the demographic has changed, but I think that, Edward, you noted that we're really only halfway through that impact. We don't even know what to expect in 1 month. That's true in India, it's true all over the world. So maybe we can postpone that question to a later time and go to our third question and ask you, Jane, to head off and how you would see the post COVID-19 world, how that internationalization abroad will be replaced by internationalization at home.
Thank you. Well, I think it's important to drop back to the issue of why it's important for students and for people generally to internalize the skills, curiosity, and ethical insights that we learn through international exchange. And when we do that, a starting point that I think many of the study abroad staff help students with, especially those who run a orientation course before study abroad and a reflection course after study abroad. I think those may become more necessary and popular in a way. whether it's a whole course or just a, a series of meetings. That people should, students should, we all should consider what are our ties internationally. My father was an immigrant. So what does that mean for me as somebody studying internationalization? What are the personal ties of the student to internationalization sitting at home? Are they in a community that is diverse, where there are other cultures that they really must learn about and should care about? So I think the idea of bringing those skills, that curiosity, the ethical responsibility to the community around us in our home country, not just when we take a trip, but actually when we're living our lives here, incorporating those values into our daily existence, appreciating people who may be described by some as the other wrongly. They're not the other once we get to know people. So I think it's very important that internationalization skills operate in our global world at home as well as when we travel.
Oh, thank you. And Ross, would you comment on this as well?
Yes, because I think, just to build on what Jane is saying, is that, if I look at this, at least initially from an academic perspective, I think there's always going to be a mix of inbound and outbound students. International students will still come to the US, to Italy, to the UK, and other parts of the world. Maybe not in the numbers that they did before the pandemic, but there will still be that inflow. With respect, and then similarly, you'll see the same effect with outbound students. It's the type of curiosity that Jane is talking about. Curiosity, connection. What we are seeing, I think, and will continue to see, is that even in a virtual world, there is this commitment to pluralism, to global awareness, and to multiculturalism. And that the world has always been like that. It's just that now we're seeing it in a more accelerated manner. Now, there are tendencies to resist that type of global perspective or that type of pluralism, but that's part of human history as well. We know, though, that the tendency is always toward a type of cultural and human convergence. The pandemic has been sort of ironic in the sense that it has kept, it fostered insularity, or it increased insularity that was already there, but it also piqued awareness of the other and how the other becomes part of our general mindset and our general acceptance. So my sense is that this tension is always going to continue, but that pluralism and multicultural dynamics are sort of the unrelenting force, and they're part of the natural order of things. And it's sort of our job as internationalists to keep making that argument, even in the face of countervailing tendencies.
Gudmundur, I'd like to add one thing, if I may.
Please.
And that is the perspective of the NGO in India, that students engaging in virtual mobility from their home country, working on rural development problems in India, are learning global issues. They're learning how to contribute to global problem solutions. And that has a value in terms of satisfaction in work. It has a value in terms of exposing people to career opportunities. And of course, it exposes people to issues that they may not confront in their home environment. So it seems to me that kind of virtual mobility has a very high value for familiarizing students who may be living in a first world country with what's happening around the world and how they can contribute to it.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it, when you see that isolation has led to internationalization in a way, that when you're isolated in your own home, your next door neighbor is no closer to you than somebody 3,000 miles away. But you can, and again, it's, well, unless Fabrizio and Edward, do you want to discuss on this topic?
Can I challenge Jane on that a bit?
Yeah, please.
Because international student mobility has always favoured the global north. And within the global north, it's normally favoured a small, wealthy elite who can afford to make the most of these opportunities to travel as part of their programmes. Worth bearing in mind that fewer than 10%, I mean, a lot fewer than 10% of UK undergraduates go abroad as part of their degree. I mean, that's how, I mean, the British have proved themselves peculiarly insular in the last 5 years. I do accept that. But I don't think we're unique in the world. And so when we ran a summer school recently, we found that actually it was a virtual summer school, an online summer school. We had twice as many students, and we had a load more students from the global south and a lot more students from poor backgrounds in the UK. And because it was designed to be a virtual event, it wasn't second best, it wasn't a poor alternative, it was the summer school. I think there was something really powerful about that, Jane. And I think if we're going to democratize much of this benefit, which I generally agree about internationalization, broad perspectives, it can't just rely upon people traveling around. In fact, if the gold standard is traveling around and everybody else is getting something a bit second rate, I think that itself is socially divisive. And the thing I'd say is that we're now starting to look at esports and esports technology, which lots of our young people are very familiar with, to create virtual platforms where we can collaborate with people in the UK who are working really close with people in hubs in India or in China or in Taiwan, in our case, so that you can create a degree of interconnectivity at a local level, but then you can share that using games, esports technology in really quite a sophisticated way. And the key thing about that is, of course, that many of these students get their social life through gaming. They know how to be social online in ways that we don't. And I think there's something in that we're just missing about where the world is going here that could be profoundly democratizing.
Well, thank you for this. You know, we had planned to deal with under your leadership with the question of research productivity, but I'd like to skip over that and take this, continue this theme, and maybe all of you could contribute more on this, because you will have heard in the earlier sessions the very point that you make, that internationalization has been for the elite. We know that. We know from the Indian experience, we know the people that go abroad, we know what it costs compared to the normal, well, the median salary of a family, what it costs to send a person abroad. I send, you know, many of my students to LLM studies abroad. I know the sacrifices that have to be taken even by the wealthier people. What we've identified this problem. What can we do about it? What can we do to ensure? What can we do to make it more of an egalitarian process? Make this internationalization, as the question was raised to us, based on symmetry, fairness, and equal opportunities to everyone. Does anyone have any? Please comment on this. It was very important to our earlier speakers in the earlier sessions.
If I may add just a couple of thoughts, I would say that definitely the post-pandemic situation in which we are, where everybody now can access through platform to different universities, has tremendously increased democratization. I mean, it's not just a privilege of the so-called jet set people. And I'm also thinking about, for example, people with disabilities. I mean, they would have an impossible obstacle to bypass in order to reach a different country. So definitely these platforms have provided a service which is, let's say, useful in terms of human rights. But I'm also adding, as a final thought, the access to people. I mean, if you want to, today, thanks to this platform, and you're doing research, or even if you're a student in your second year, you're doing research, you may contact a professor which is in another continent, even 2 or 3, ask questions, have short meetings. And I don't know anybody who just refuses. Actually, it's even intriguing and exciting for everybody to do that. So it has transformed also our job as professors by reaching more closely, let's say, people that just 3 or 4 years ago would have never had an opportunity to meet with other professors and other students.
Yeah, thank you. Russell, would you like to add how to deal with the inequity built into internationalization.
Right. I mean, this is to kind of pick up a little bit on what Edward was saying, was we've noticed here that we, especially with respect to conventional mobility, we in the US already have a two-tiered system, whereby those who have means go abroad, and those who have fewer means either struggle to go abroad or end up enrolling more in virtual programming. Even before the pandemic, this was true. I mean, and it's kind of a double-edged sword in the sense that when the pandemic hit and we moved completely to virtual study abroad and virtual global internships, we saw an increase in the number of students from underrepresented minorities who enrolled in these programs. And we thought, well, that's quite positive. This is something we want to promote. At the same time, we're trying to think of what's going to happen after the pandemic. Are we going to revert to this situation where we've got this two-tiered system? So we're thinking very closely. We're working with our Division of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion on campus to make sure that that doesn't happen, to make sure that we afford the same opportunities really across the board. Now, there's no sort of ill intent, on the part of institutions, but there is a kind of lethargy, and we have to resist it, because, and it gets back to this sort of pluralistic, multicultural world society that I think we're trying to build. Equity and access become key priorities that we have to promote. So we need to police ourselves in this regard as we develop our planning post-COVID.
Yes, thank you. Jane, would you like to come back on this more specific point?
Yes. So what I'd like to add, and of course, Edward is touching on this in terms of some of the games and other activities that have been developed by his university. But one of the things about actual travel abroad is that the active learning is very clearly there. And with virtual mobility, there's a need for faculty and others working on curriculum development and activity development to figure out how to engage students actively as they're hearing about, learning about, how will they engage with the international experience that is being delivered virtually. So I think that places a greater burden on faculty and perhaps others who support faculty to develop these activities, but that's really crucial. I wanted to ask Edward a question about virtual field trips, since it may not be apparent to the listener that how those differ from a video. I imagine they do. So I wondered if Edward would.
Yeah, of course, Jane. So they use virtual reality settings much more, which you can explore with both your tutors, but also more importantly, your peers. You can build certain questions or tasks or challenges in that virtual reality experience, where students start to unravel the complexity or the solution to the problem the field trip was trying to address. And then you can link other resources to that, Jane. So that's the way that they work. They've been very successful, actually, for our students. They were more work for their colleagues. But if you think about, if going to Spain, it takes you 10 days to do it for 5 days learning, then actually putting the time in to do it virtually might actually be less of a burden. Although you miss out on going to Spain, I do accept that, and that may be a bit of a side benefit of being an academic, of course. So I do. There is something about that, which I just think is. Oh, and what we know is half those students wouldn't have done the field trip because they wouldn't have been able to afford to go. That's the other crucial factor.
Yeah,
right. So has that been done in a developing country setting?
I think the ones that they did recreated the field trips that they do. So one was to Spain. There may have been others, Jane, which had a similar, had other settings. But initially,
I'm
it
sure-
started by, well, it's you do what you know, don't you, Jane? So you recreate virtually what you would have done physically.
Right,
There may be a
right.
much
So when-
better way of thinking about that when you're never going somewhere physically. Yeah.
Right. So I'm sure the Indian team would be happy to work with virtual reality people on getting people into a village in North India.
Yes, yes.
Be
Thank you for
fantastic.
that.
Just drop me a note about that and we'll see what we
You
can
bet.
do.
Yeah,
That'd
please.
be
I think that's a
brilliant.
very good takeaway from our session. Well, Ed, I can ask you to continue go back to the fourth question. That is how research productivity has been impacted.
Yes. So this has been a real challenge, I think, actually, because I think it has had overall a negative impact upon research capacity and capability. And that's largely been because many researchers have not been able to access their facilities in country and therefore can't take forward their research with their collaborators overseas. So it's not just about lack of travel. You can overcome the lack of travel by devices such as this. You can't overcome, if you're an early modern historian, as my daughter is, not being able to go to the archive because it's closed, or not going to your lab because it's not deemed to be safe to do so for a period of time. So I think that is what we've seen, certainly in the UK, delays in paper, delays in research grants being completed, obviously delays in PhDs being completed, and extension funding being granted, however, et cetera, et cetera. But I do think we are learning about new collaborative platforms. So before COVID-19, as part of our new strategy, we already had a plan for a virtual institute for advanced studies, because we saw this coming, not COVID-19, but the challenge of international travel being sustained at the same level as before. And so we have a relationship with Microsoft to be a pilot innovator of their new products. And they gave us a really interesting set of potential ways of working with international collaborators in real time to create a level of experience and interaction you just don't get from a Teams meeting or Zoom meeting. And we have made some progress with those. It hasn't compensated for the delay in the short term, but I think it might well compensate for the delay in the medium term, given the confidence and competence colleagues have now got in using these particular devices.
Yeah, thank you for this. And well, we've had some questions come in. In fact, many of them relate to the follow-up of what you're saying. And in fact, one of them is very interesting to me, because when I was listening to Dr. Shashi Tharoor this morning, in which he spoke about the difference between, well, actually the need to enhance in liberal arts studies in India. We all know, Jane, you could tell them, everyone, we all know that there's always been a greater emphasis of parents, you might say, in the relationship between your education and employability. But specifically, one of our questions is, and perhaps I could ask you to answer that, is what is the difference between mobility for STEM and non-STEM?
So in the UK, we're seeing a decline in demand for arts and humanities subjects as traditionally taught. And that's true across all universities. Of course, interestingly, they often link to a language, don't they? So you're seeing a declining number of students, but a high proportion of you for the UK go overseas because they're doing history in Spanish or history in Mandarin, and that drives their actually necessity to have an overseas placement. It's part of the course. But the focus in the UK these days isn't on liberal arts education, it's on employability skills. It's on, if you're going to do arts humanities, digital humanities, it's about platforms around creative digital events, music, performance. It's how you start to use people's interest in the arts, humanities, and culture to develop something which is digital, which means they can pursue a career in the digitally enabled creative arts or humanities. So it's still going on, but it's shifting from history to kind of games technology, creative writing with games technology. And I think that's a really interesting shift. And of course, the more people do that, the more they get confident in their own technical skills, the less they need the international dimension of that. And of course, those particular subjects are not multilingual. They're conducted in English. And it's a peculiar problem for England in the world speaking English. because we don't have to go abroad to polish our English, do we? Because we just don't, because it's our native language. So there's something about that which is peculiar to England, which may make us unrepresentative, notwithstanding the fact we've got a fantastically multicultural integrated society, which is the envy of many countries, but we don't like going abroad much anyway. So England's a funny old place in this regard, but I do think there's a challenge now to education for education's sake in the UK. I think that idea is slowly dying.
Well, following up on this, because one of the questions asks, one of the questioners on the audience asked about different modalities for virtual mobility beyond traditional platforms like Zoom and MS Teams. In fact, as you were describing, it's already a new generation. Any others would contribute to this? What do we see as an enhance from what is already looking very old-fashioned, the way we're speaking today?
I can maybe pick up on that
please,
a little bit, because and this ties back to some of the things that Edward was talking about, is that in my previous job, I was at Iowa, I was the director of the Division of World Languages, Literatures, and Cultures.
Yes, indeed.
And so we actually invested a number of resources and got some grants to develop virtual reality as it related to study abroad. And so we have in our old building a new lab dedicated to this purpose. So Edward mentioned Spain. One of the things that we have a lot of programming in Barcelona and in Madrid. So what we did was we recreated virtually those cities, the downtowns of those cities, so that students could experience them virtually before actually experiencing them in person. Now, what I think will happen in the future, and what's already been happening, is that we can start to collaborate with colleagues in Barcelona and in Madrid through our program providers, for example, to enhance these platforms. I think that this is something that we have done a little bit also in our Office of Admissions for international students. So we have recreated virtual versions of the University of Iowa campus, of our downtown. And so we've done this in-house. What I think we need to do is to collaborate with our partners at other institutions so that we can kind of share these experiences electronically. I mean, Zoom meetings are fine, but there are other more sophisticated and deeper platforms that we can use to develop co-programming and co-curricular. We see this a little bit, in our global classroom offerings that have been created in our College of Business and have been created through our College of Music as well. But we can definitely take this to a higher level, and I think we're all interested in seeing where that might lead us.
Yeah, thank you for that. In fact, one of our questions from the audience is about deals with digital fatigue, and it's a question too. I don't know which of you is prepared to answer this. I know it for myself when we're teaching. I think that in the law school in India, we find perhaps too much attention to in-class instruction. You would know, Jane, that and similarly, when we don't monitor attendance in the Indian system. You have 70%. You have to have a 70% attendance. It's like being in a grade school in order to be able to sit for an exam, a final exam. And now we've not actually gone to monitoring people's attendance, but the whole idea of spending, in the case of Indian students, law students, 6 to 8 hours watching lectures online, it certainly has ramifications. Does any of you wish to comment on that?
Can I? Because I think that's a very unsophisticated way of doing virtual learning. And I think we've done it in the last 18 months because we haven't got much time to sort ourselves out. But as time goes by, people are, I think, finding increasingly sophisticated ways of varying the student experience. So it's not just about watching asynchronous material, but it is using games, it's using tutorials, it's using other devices and techniques, pedagogical techniques, that I think give it the same structure and rhythm as a typical academic week used to have. And what we've got too focused on, I think, is the particular event. And what we haven't thought enough about is what's the rhythm of the week? What's the variety of interactions students are going to have across modules on this course over a week, a month, and a term? That's quite hard to do, but I think that's what we need to get to.
Thank you for that. Please, anyone else? Jane.
The value of an NGO as a partner is that we bring actual real world problems to the fore, and students can work on those. I know with University of Iowa, we've talked about the hydrology department doing lab work related to water analysis that is directly related to the issues that are faced by the communities with which the NGO is working in India. So I think games are good, but also there are real world problems to which students can contribute directly through their project-based learning. And the more that we have collaborations, yes, over Zoom, but also the faculty in the home institution that is familiar with India, for example, can be a good touchstone for students to get some practical input about projects that they're working on with an Indian NGO.
Right, and I would just add that one of the really encouraging things that we've seen in the collaboration between Iowa and Sehgal is that faculty are sort of undergoing an interdisciplinary resurgence. So, for example, if you look at water, you know, the technical aspect or the engineering aspect is obviously key, but it doesn't, you know, provide the whole narrative. And what we've seen is that, and this is part of where Jane's expertise really has been incredibly helpful, is that if we look at the importance of radio, for example, if we look at the importance of communication, we're going to need faculty from the School of either Communication Studies or Journalism and Mass Communications to help develop a communication plan around water safety and water protection. Similarly, we have faculty in our Department of Gender, Women's, and Sexuality Studies who have assisted us in this communication plan, who have, you know, been open to sort of learning about the science of water conservation, but also seeing how it affects, or seeing what its impacts are on a social level. As a result, you know, you see this convergence of expertise that I think has been facilitated in the virtual era. The question now is to apply it on site and virtually once we begin to emerge from COVID. I don't think that there's any doubt that that hybridity is going to be the watchword moving forward. Everything that we do in terms of research, teaching, applied experience is going to be a mix of the electronic and the in-person. And so the more we can do to kind of wrap our minds around that reality, adjust to it, and respond to both practical needs, but also sort of core philosophical educational principles, the more we can do to put ourselves in the best position moving forward.
Well, thank you for that. In fact, this kind of brings us to our final question. Two of the questions addressed to us from the audience deal with the future. Of course, this is the question for all of us in all of our various spheres. What is going to happen in the field of internationalization of higher education in the future? Could each of you spend a couple of minutes just looking slightly forward and seeing what is the situation going to be in post-COVID? And we would then close, I would close after hearing from each of you on that. Jane, would you begin, please?
Here I am. Oh, yeah, thank you very much. Well, I think that taking stock of what
so could you speak into the microphone, Fabrizio?
Yeah, can you hear me now? Yes.
Yes, thank you.
No, I'm saying taking stock of all different aspects which has been raised. Well, I think that the first point is that we're not going to throw away what we have learned in these 2 years, but actually we're going to treasure all this experience, and we're going to treasure it in terms of teaching and in terms of research. I partially disagree with some of what was said before. I think that some fields in the university have been advantaged by that. Of course, it's been much more difficult for scientists like doing chemistry and so on, but I'm thinking about social sciences, lawyers, economists, international relations scholars, and politicians and politics scholars have been actually tremendously advantaged. I mean, we have increased enormously the capabilities of our research networks and activities. So actually our publication rate is much higher now than before. And so this shows that higher education cannot really escape the challenges and the solutions which have been proposed. I don't want to say thanks to COVID because it sounds like a provocation, but we certainly have some things that we have learned and we can do pretty well at this point. And virtual mobility programs, I think, will stay with us also. I think it will be a mistake to go back to the old system, conventional mobility, as it has been said. And I think that younger generations, perhaps some of them are focused on only climate change. I would say that in general, they're all rightly focused on the United Nations development goals. And with the techniques that we have learned, we can certainly fulfill a number of them. Think about objective number 4, inclusive education, quality of the education, promote lifelong opportunities. We have certainly new tools that we can use. Peace, justice, and strong institutions. Well, that depends, of course, also on the teachers, but certainly in terms of teaching international law, there has been a tremendous, let's say, move forward. Climate action and of course clean energy are something that are in the UNDGs and are with us. So all in all, I could say that we have learned to rationalize mobility, the freedom of mobility of people, and to use it when we really need it, and to use much better our time and research time with new technologies. That will be my take.
Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you for referring to the UN, the predominant global organization, something which I've supported ever since I left law school, so from early times. Jane, would you carry on in your final comment?
Sure.
And then Ed and then Russell, please.
So from the interactions with the University of Iowa, our partner, we've been able to have closer conversations between the NGO, SM Sehgal Foundation in India, and the university faculty in small groups, the way one would have coffee clutches if you were together. And that I think has been a real boost. People are not exhausted from travel. People are now used to Zoom, and they're using that to collaborate informally, build trust, find common interest. And I think that what I'd like to do is take Edward's virtual reality and make sure that some of the virtual reality situations are showing those village crisis situations for students to learn about that, and for faculty and students to apply their minds to possible solutions. And that will be a combination of Indian faculty and students and faculty and students from abroad, but getting the focus on those real world problems in using this new technology. So I look forward to exploring that more. And I agree, of course, with Russ that it will be hybrid, that there will still be travel and but that we can reach many more people when we're using the new technologies. Thank you.
So Edward, please.
Yeah, something slightly different for me, I think, which is I believe universities are, in a way, they're in the customer service business, aren't they? And the way in which we use data about students, I think, is years behind how the really sophisticated customer service organizations use their data to segment their student or customer base and to personalize the experience that students have. And I think we're going to see a massive transformation in the next 10 years of universities getting much more sophisticated about designing packages for students. So, for instance, you agree with a student because of their particular needs that they're not going to submit an assignment by due date, but when they're ready. I mean, this could be a major change, I think, in pedagogy. And within that, I think you'll see much more focus on what do students need to learn to build on their strengths and to ameliorate their deficits, of which international mobility will be one part. I think there'll be less of it, but it might be better targeted and have more impact, particularly for those students from poorer backgrounds who probably most need it.
Yeah, thank you for that. And again, I'm so glad that we're reminding ourselves constantly about that we have an obligation not only to the elite or the world travelers, we can never forget that in anything that we do. Finally, Russ, would you add to what you were saying before about the future?
Sure. So I'd like to offer words of reassurance, but also a warning at the same time. So in terms of reassurance, we know that, at least in higher ed circles, we were able to manage this pandemic relatively well. We were at a crisis point when we were bringing home students, when we were trying to find out, just what the pandemic was and what it meant. We adapted quickly, and I think we adapted successfully. At the same time, I think the pandemic exposed the vulnerability of our profession and of the world situation in general, and that vulnerability, I think, comes through complacency, becoming too focused on oneself or on one's culture. I don't want us to squander the opportunities that the pandemic has given us, and I don't want us to squander the achievements that we've been able to accomplish because we did adapt so quickly. So my advice is to develop best practices, to really take stock of what we did well during the pandemic and apply those methods and practices moving forward, be they in terms of solidifying partnerships with NGOs or other collaborators abroad, or in terms of designing new curricula, to make sure that we don't lapse into our old and presumably bad habits. I think we need to take stock of what we did well and make sure that we hold ourselves accountable and apply those contributions and those advances moving forward.
Thank you very much. It's a good way to finish off our session, for which I thank all of you very much for joining us. It's been a real pleasure discussing this with you both Friday and today. I think it's a model for how we, as we were saying earlier, all of us, how we move forward. We should not lose the benefits of what we've experienced. Bad experiences can often lead to good future experiences. So I thank each and every one of you. And I thank also the organizers for making this possible. And I conclude just by saying the very best to you, all of you, and take care, and you and your families. Thank you, everybody.